everyone, and welcome to We Go Back. I'm your host, Bryan Abou Chacra, and on this week's episode, we will be reviewing the life and death of Jeremy Bentham and Fleur, the 7th and 8th episodes from Season 5 of Lost. When we open up, we see two new characters, Caesar and Ileana, who we had previously seen in the last episode. Caesar was in the line while Jack was checking in Locke's coffin, while we saw Ileana go through security escorting Sayid. So what we're seeing is the survivors of Ajira Flight 316 on the Hydra Island. And the most interesting part about this open is that we find out that John Locke is alive. And this is the first time that we've seen him on the island since he's tried to get everybody to come back. Locke wakes up in Tunisia, but this time the whole area is under surveillance. And the one thing that I picked up from the people who came to rescue him is that I could understand what they were saying because they were speaking Arabic. And they were trying to get him into the truck because they were trying to help him. One thing I've always appreciated from Lost is that they use other languages well in the show. And I brought this up many times, and the fact that they actually had a secret into what was really happening, but it was just in another language. Now, when Locke wakes up in Widmore's hospital, I wanted you to pay attention to a recurring theme for Locke's character, which is waking up and looking down to check on if he's still paralyzed. And it always tends to be the right foot that they focus on. So just interesting that that's the one that's in the cast. Widmore, however, speaks very candidly with Locke about the island here, tells him that Tunisia is the exit and that he's here to help John bring them back to the island. We also see that John got the name Jeremy Bentham from Widmore because he found it funny that his parents named him after another British philosopher. But in this entire encounter, we're all thinking the same thing that Locke is. Ben Linus told us that Widmore came to attack the island. But Widmore raises a very good point about Ben. How often can you trust what that guy tells you? And it really does seem like Widmore is genuinely here to help Locke. He also brings up the fact that they had met when Widmore was 17. We know that Widmore knew about Locke this entire time. That's what we're learning from this encounter. And if he was really trying to kill Locke, he would have done it long before. Let's move along to John's encounter with Sayid. And the main thing that I want you to take away from this scene is that question that Sayid asks Locke. He's wondering where Locke's motivation comes from. Who's manipulating Locke this time? This is a great question for a character like Locke because he's the son of a con man and he's amenable to coercion. Next, we see that Locke goes to visit Walt in New York. And you would assume that he was there to invite Walt to come back, but rather is told that Walt dreamt he was on an island in a suit surrounded by a lot of people who wanted to hurt him. Now, this is important because you have to remember the relationship between Locke and Walt on the island. Locke knew that something was special about Walt and encouraged him to pursue it. After this, Locke goes to visit Hurley, and their interaction is kind of funny because the whole time Hurley is talking to Locke, he doesn't believe that he's actually there. He thinks Locke has died on the island, so he's almost questioning Locke's mortality. Throughout this episode, Locke had been helped by an associate of Widmore's named Abaddon, and we had previously seen him when Locke was in rehab for breaking his back. And I appreciate that Abaddon finally addresses his past encounter with Locke. He tells us that his purpose is to get people where they need to be. And this is the first direct acknowledgement of any past connection on and off the island since Desmond and Jack. But the main focus of this entire interaction is another example that Widmore knew about Locke the whole time. And if he was really going to threaten him, he would have done something about it a long time ago. After this, Locke goes to visit Kate, but again poses a very interesting point against him, which causes him to be a little bit more introspective about how far he's come since losing Helen. All of the people that he's met in this episode are getting him to think about the different parts of his life that used to tie him to being away from the island, and they're getting him to question their importance to him when he knows what his calling is. I think this point is driven home when we see that Helen is actually dead. Abaddon brings up a very interesting point when they're at her grave. He talks about how their paths led them here just like her path led her to death. kind of talking about how everything is all inevitable and really questioning free choice and free will. And now let's get to our last meetup with Jack. A very interesting set of circumstances put Locke in front of him. And even though Jack is being faced with all this evidence of how Locke is right, he still refuses to believe it. Instead, Jack tells John his real opinion of him and says a lot of really hateful and hurtful things. And just as Jack is leaving the room, he gets hooked by Locke, telling him that his father says hello. And that's something that Jack can't refute. This whole scene explains why Jack didn't want to read the letter in the previous episode. He feels some sort of guilt because the last thing that he said to Locke before Locke killed himself was that he was a lonely old man who wasn't special. We now get to the death of Jeremy Bentham. We see Locke try to hang himself, but there are a few things that I want you to pay attention to in this scene because it's pretty straightforward, but if you go back and watch it, you'll see some really interesting stuff. The first thing is that if you notice, John is wearing white and black in this scene, a white shirt and black slacks. The other is that it seems as though Ben is being very helpful. He's just listening. He's manipulating John to try to get information from him because once he realizes that Eloise Hawking is the person who's going to help them get back on the island, he kills John. This makes me think that Ben has something else in mind here. If he was really trying to get all these people back to the island, why would he kill John? So this made me think, we have actually seen Ben try to kill John a few times before. And we've also talked about the jealousy that Ben has towards Locke because he seems to be chosen. And if you look at how everything played out, if you swap out Locke for Ben, they are all coming back to the island. And it looks like it's Ben who made it happen. And this ties into the comment from Widmore saying that Ben stands on the shoulders of Widmore's work. Now, the final scene of this episode is kind of fun. We see Locke and Caesar on the island trying to figure out how he got here. And Locke seems almost surprised to realize that everybody came back, that his friends were the reason that he returned. He succeeded and brought them back to the island and had to die in the process, but they are all here. And we also find out that there are survivors of Flight 316 who we hadn't expected, because the end of the episode shows us that Ben is among these survivors. And that'll take us into Fleur, where we follow the events of Jin, Miles, Sawyer, Daniel, and Juliet after Locke turned the wheel. We see that they've actually been put way far back in time than they expected to be. They're actually in the 70s. And I love how they reveal to us where they are by the title card 3 years later and seeing the inside of a Dharma station. I also really appreciate how the story is written here by revealing to us who Fleur is. In this episode, we're also going to get a lot of concrete examples on how whatever happened really means. We had started to see some of these examples back in the last episode when we realized Widmore had come to save Locke from Tunisia because he had met him when he was a child, but now we're also going to see how the characters' decisions affect everyone's future. We get to see Daniel being distraught over something we're told he does in his future, but was in Charlotte's past. So one of these examples that stands out to me is the circumstances that bring all of them to be part of the Dharma Initiative. As they're returning to the beach, it doesn't seem as though it's happenstance that they come across Amy and Paul getting attacked by some of the hostiles. It almost feels like everything is set up when you consider how it all works out at the end. I did want to discuss the conversation Sawyer has with Miles as they're walking. He tells him that he used to lie for a living, and this is absolutely referring to how he is a con man. He's trained his whole life to learn how to lie so that it could be believable. And if you want to take a leap of faith and take it a step further, it's almost as if he's been trained his whole life for this moment. Even more evidence of previous occupations paying off on the island. We also see Juliet stepping back into her role of being a maternity doctor to deliver Amy's baby. But we are seeing again what seems like entire lifetime of training for this particular moment. Also, it's very nice to see Juliet be able to deliver a baby on the island without having any complications at all. And while this is all going on, we get a little bit of an explanation on how Jin happened to stumble across the survivors of Flight 316. Sawyer has had him doing sweeps across the island since they've gotten there to try to find them. And I don't think it's coincidence that he happened to come across them the moment they landed back on the island. Now, moving along, one of the coolest things in this episode is that we get to see Sawyer flex his con man muscles again. While he's having a conversation with Horace about where they came from, he's able to construct a very legitimately plausible story because of everything he's taken in on the island since they got there. Using the black rock as a point of focus gives them credibility with Horace because, one, either Horace doesn't know about the boat, but it's something that he can go research if he needs to, or two, he does know about the boat, and it gives plausibility to their being in this area. But it's really great to see Sawyer using his skills once again, especially when we get that reversed when Richard comes and confronts the Dharma Initiative about the men Sawyer and Juliet killed. He convinces Richard of who he is by being completely upfront. He gets what he wants out of him and gains his confidence by being fully honest with him, and references their encounter from back in the 50s with very specific detail to what actually happened that day. And for somebody who spent his entire life as a con man, I think this is a very great hurdle that we're seeing Sawyer overcome. And we're almost seeing a very big transition for him in this episode because as we find out, he's actually the head of the security at the Dharma Initiative. This all ties back into the concept of whatever happened. Everything here seems to be happening for a reason, and it continues to substantiate Locke's claim to everyone that they're all here for a purpose. Considering how many coincidences seem to happen in this episode and with so many characters and how everyone crosses paths, I love that they're showing you how important all of these characters are to each other. Now, a couple of small points that I want to make sure you guys notice before we end this episode. As Sawyer is walking back to his home with Juliet, one of the first shots that we see is somebody playing a game of chess where we see both the white and the black pieces. And then, of course, the ending of this episode with Horace. Sawyer had gone through a very similar situation, and he wouldn't have been able to help Horace get over it in this moment if he didn't have his relationship with Kate. And then, of course, the very next day, she arrives. Folks, thanks for sticking through this episode of We Go Back. Loving each episode with you guys. Next week, we will be reviewing Namaste and He's Our You. Send your thoughts, questions, anything to wegobackpodcast@gmail.com. Follow me on Twitter @KingLordBryan. And until next week, you guys stay safe.